I'm the only one standing between you and a cocktail, so I'll keep this brief. This is never a good position to be in, but I do think it's good to at least offer kind of some closing thoughts for those of you who are here this morning. We kicked it off with a panel on kind of general trends, and so I just kind of threw together a couple of quick slides kind of based on what I heard today. A lot of good content going on, and hope you got value out of it. You know, I don't even need the slides if they're not working. Is this the?
Yeah.
Okay. So capital trends. I think it goes without saying. You know, it's frothy. You know, depending on who you look at, I mean, there was about $5 billion in venture capital raised last year alone. That's up 20%. That's only going to continue. We heard a little bit talk about, you know, the options are changing as well. It's no longer purely VC. We now have ICOs, private equity is playing a big role, and also the exit options are expanding. You know, public companies, if you look at the number of publicly traded companies in the U.S. has declined about 30% since 2005. And if you also look at what the median revenue is for software companies that go public, not just cyber companies, any software company, that's essentially tripled more or less since kind of before the crash of 2008. So, you know, the median revenue for companies that go public today is around 300 million. And you can look at CrowdStrike, which just filed their S1 this week as an example of that. So that is kind of changing the dynamic, and I think is leading to more emphasis on strategic exits, M&A, and not necessarily the IPO option, but it does mean that there's still, you know, more options that are now in play now for companies and also for investors in terms of how to exit their existing cyber investments. Sorry. Just kind of general market trends, right? You know, the threat landscape continues to evolve, and I think for all the talk about, you know, highly sophisticated attacks and need to defend against them, you know, as I think we've seen throughout this panel and through other stats from organizations like Forrester, right? Basic attacks are still successful, like phishing, like credential stuffing, like account takeover. Users like to click on things and they can't help themselves, and so that is still an unfortunate problem, the human factor aspect of that. So you can have all the greatest you know, options and technologies employed to protect yourself, but if your users aren't properly trained to be kind of enabled in order to identify things, you are still unfortunately going to be at risk. And I think the same issue, you know, the threat actors are, you know, increasing in their sophistication. Just, you know, the types of attacks that we hear about in all ways, shapes, and form. You know, one that's not a cyber attack, but kind of shows how hackers will look to compromise processes. For those of you who didn't see, there are a couple of Chinese nationals who are graduate students in Oregon, and basically they brought literally hundreds or actually thousands of fraudulent iPhones with them from China, and basically smashed the screens and then brought them to the Apple store and asked for a replacement, got a replacement iPhone because Apple couldn't actually tell these were fake iPhones, and then they went and sold them on eBay. And they basically took about $1 million worth, sold $1 million worth of iPhones before they were caught, right? So clearly they had to determine that, you know, privacy and data theft doesn't necessarily apply to digital assets. It can apply to physical assets as well, and that's, you know, a challenge that we'll continue to face. You know, for all the talk about kind of product, you know, I think we've seen services play a big role in cyber, whether it's assessment services, managed services, things of that sort, or people to actually help run and operationalize this stuff. Products in and of themselves play a key role, but they're not the only role. And at least from a Forrester standpoint, when we look at our budget spending data, we do show last year was the first year that the percentage of the cyber budget that went to services crossed the 50% split for the first time. So it was like 52-48 services to product for the first time. So that trend, I think, is going to continue. You know, security is a board level concern now. I have some colleagues that will look at like 10Ks of Fortune 500 companies and how many of them list cyber as a risk factor now. I can't remember the exact number, but it's increasingly listed as a risk factor. Companies are aware that their organizations, their brands are under attack, and consequently shareholders and investors will reward or punish them if they're not doing an effective job of that. And you can look no further than, say, companies like Equifax or others, which you know, suffered, you know, a fair amount as a result of you know, fairly poor data protection schemes. You know, lastly, you know, CISOs are at capacity, you know, both in terms of their budget, in terms of figuring out where to spend it, and spend it efficiently. And I think they're increasingly being asked by the board or senior management to make sure they're getting value out of their investments. So I know there was an earlier, I think on the panel about, you have to make it easier for the user and actually demonstrate value. I mean, that's ultimately, companies that are going to be successful in this space are ones that can do that. And just saying that we can block threats in and of themselves isn't necessarily enough. You need to show how you operationalize that and make that more efficient organization. Lastly, you can't really go anywhere today without talking about AI, automation, machine learning. It has tremendous benefits, but it also introduces potentially new risks or other scenarios that organizations need to be aware of. Whenever you automate something, the risk with that automation comes efficiency, but also potentially lack of visibility, because you may lose insight of the process you're automating. And if you don't have good knowledge of that, there may actually be a backdoor or some other parts of that process that you now have lost visibility to that can now be compromised. And that's actually, I close it with a, inspirational quote actually from Bill Gates, but I think it's very relevant in this case, which is that if you have a very efficient process, automation will optimize and magnify that efficiency. If you automate a insufficient process, the inefficiency will be magnified. And I think that theme is a general quote, but I think that applies equally well in the cyberspace. So that's basically kind of what I wanted to share with you. Again, I'll be sticking around if you want any. Happy to talk to you any further, and hope this was a good session. And hopefully we can continue this on and see you here next year. So that's it. Thank you.